Now, before I bring our panelists on, I just want to try to set up this first meeting and talk a little bit about them and what we hope to achieve here. In the last 10 years, in Latin America, we have seen an astonishing amount of growth, notwithstanding the financial crisis of 2008. 70 million people in this region in just 10 years have moved out of what the World Bank classifies as extreme poverty. 50 million have moved into the global middle class. Among the large emerging economies in the last decade, only Brazil and Mexico showed a measurable decline in income inequality, even though the region remains the world's most unequal in terms of economic distribution. Still, progress was made. The great question here is how to accelerate economic growth by including more people in it. We know that there is a global jobs crisis among the young. We know, for example, that in Egypt, when the young people gathered in Tahrir Square and sparked, along with what happened in Tunisia, the so-called Arab Spring, one reason they were there is that the Egyptian education system produced 400,000 university graduates a year, and the Egyptian economy produced nowhere near 400,000 jobs for young people with university degrees. When the economic crisis hit Greece and Spain, they had unemployment rates around 25%, but the youth unemployment rates were twice that. That's a terrible loss to the productive potential of the country, and it aggravated unemployment. It aggravated inequality. So all over the world, there is a job shortage. New businesses are not being formed at the requisite rate necessary to reduce inequality. And social policies generally have failed to adequately address this everywhere, including in the United States. So today, we are talking about, in this first panel, designing opportunities for growth. Can you consciously pursue a strategy that involves the governments, the private sector, the regional institutions, and civil society groups to both accelerate growth and reduce inequality in a way that is good for the environment and doesn't complicate our efforts to deal with climate change? In that sense, this first panel focuses on what I think is perhaps the most important question of the 21st century. By way of introduction, I was in politics for 3 decades. I loved every day of it. But I noticed that no matter what I said or did about policy, almost all the public discussions was centered on 2 questions. What are you going to do? And how much money are you going to spend on it? Are you going to cut taxes? How much? Are you going to invest in education? How much? Will you offer incentives to develop the economy? How much? Will you cut the deficit? How much? There was almost no focus on the third question, which I think is more important in the 21st century, which is, whatever you're going to do, and however much money you have or don't have, how do you propose to do it? How do you propose to turn your good intentions into positive changes that achieve the goals that you and your society have? So that is something that I really want us to talk about today. We can start with a few success stories. As I said, Mexico and Brazil had some significant success in reducing inequality. I think here it was the Bolsa Familia program, building on the Bolsa Escola program, which started earlier, providing tax credits to private universities to bring in more young people as students from low-income families. In Mexico, they had a program to get universal enrollment in school modeled on the Bolsa Familia program. And the previous president, Calderon, established a network of 140 tuition-free universities. Last year, Mexico, which has 1/2 the population of the United States, produced 113,000 young people with engineering degrees. The United States produced 120,000. And so for 2 years, 2011 and 2010, I don't have the 2012 figures yet, there was no net migration from Mexico to the U.S. They were growing too fast, and there were jobs there for the people. So that our relationship became more normal, more focused on trade and investment. This is the sort of thing we ought to be thinking about. I could tell you stories about projects that my own foundation works on in Colombia and Peru, but I will just say this, that the partnership that the U.S. established with Colombia and Plan Colombia has been wildly successful. It has made the current peace talks possible. The mayor of Medellin is here. I was saying last night, when I was president, Medellin was viewed as the drug capital of the world. In 2005, the IDB had its 50th anniversary conference in Medellin. And the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, protected by the United States Secret Service, went there and nobody gave it a second thought because the city belonged to the people again. In a way, it's like Berlin in the United States, in the Americas. If you look at where Haiti is today compared to where it was even before the earthquake, for all of the challenges, they're making real progress. The Caribbean has the highest electric rates in the world, but maybe the only region in the world that could run 100% on clean energy, from the sun, the wind, from geothermal, from biomass. The potential here is enormous. We all know what the problems are. And I hope we'll have some discussion from our panelists today about why you have demonstrations when things seem to be going better. I know exactly why, and I think it's not a bad thing. I do want to point this out if you look at this crowd today. Think of the difference between the response in Brazil and the response in Syria to people demonstrating in the street. In Syria, this horrible civil war that you see unfolding, that now has outside as well as indigenous elements, began with people demonstrating in the streets for greater freedom, greater involvement in the political process, and greater economic opportunity. The government decided to respond by beating people up and shooting them and jailing them. The most important thing for me as an outsider looking at this in Brazil, a country I love and pull for, was that the response of the president was, you're making a lot of good points here. We do have too much corruption still in the political system. We do have too much inequality. We do have to justify the money that's being spent. Come help us solve the problem. Be a part of the solution. Don't be a part of the problem. There is a dramatic difference that every citizen of the entire continent should be proud of in the two different responses. Conflict sometimes is very good politics and keeps certain people in power, but cooperation works better to solve problems. So, with that, I would like to introduce our morning panelists. First, Alicia Barcena, the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. Second, Isela Constantini. Isela Constantini, the President and Managing Director of General Motors Argentina. The leader of General Motors was born in Brazil to Argentine parents, so she's, both of you can take credit for her. My longtime friend, Hernando de Soto, the chairman of the Institute for Liberty and Democracy. And Ricardo Villeja Moreno, the executive vice president of Itaú Unibanco and the chief executive officer of Itaú Latam. Please be seated. So thank you for being here. And I want to start with you, Alicia, because your job is the UN Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. How big a challenge do you think income inequality is? And what do you think the most effective policies would be to address it in Latin America? Knowing, as I said, this is a huge problem everywhere. And related to that, what can we do about the global, in this region, what can we do about the global problem of youth unemployment? There is a jobs crisis for young people in every continent. This is not just your problem. Everyone is facing it.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here this morning. And I would say that why is this such a huge challenge in Latin America and the Caribbean? Because we are the most unequal region of the world, not the poorest, but the most unequal, which means that 20% of the richest of this region earns more than 50% of the productivity of the nation, or of the region, and the 20% poorest only has 5%. So this is the amount of the problem. How do we solve it? First of all, I think the most important thing that we have made in these last 2 decades to bring people out of poverty is one of the things we have to do, and it has to be done through growth, employment, no question about it, but also through good policies, good politics and good policies. The major problem of this region is low productivity. We have a region that is very low in productivity. We basically export raw materials. We need to diversify our economy. We need to bring in the small and medium-sized companies to the global change of production. And we have to close the gaps. We have very serious gaps in infrastructure, in taxation, in investment. This is a region that has been growing, yes, with less growth now this year, but based on consumption. Very little on investment, and is lowering its exports. So we have to focus on investment. It has to be infrastructure, as this country is doing, for example. I think investment can be a good solution. And for the youth, as you are saying very well, the first thing we have to do is to create new jobs that are basically linked to more productivity on new sectors. We cannot only base our development on extractive industries or on the maquila in the north. We really have to become a knowledge society, innovation, where youth are very good and green. We need to go to green development.
So, Isela, I want to call on you next. What is the role of the private sector, and how can you best relate to government? We have to do this together, it seems to me. And whatever policies government adopts have to be good for the private sector. How can we do this? How do you think it can be better organized here and across the region?
I think that we this last couple of years, we became much more global organizations. Like we see the integration coming forward, and not just from the private sectors, but we're also seeing that for the governments, for each of the countries to really play in the global world, they need to be part of this global team. So I think that we're going beyond what it was my responsibility as an individual or my responsibility as the country, as the company, but it's not us against you or me against them. It's just we need to work together. I think that the integration is just working as a team. It's much easier to fight and poverty and actually develop the business. And you can grow the business if you grow the society. So there's not an equation anymore in which you as a company, you just go there and just get the raw material, or you just go and develop a product just for that local market. You need to take leverage, and the synergies are going in towards like how do we explore the opportunities outside of the country where you are working. GM has been very, very, very interested on continuing investing across the globe. Just to give an example, out of the 10 million cars GM will sell this year, 10% are going to be sold in Latin America. 50%, I would say 25% of the total Chevrolet sales will be in Latin America. And we expect the business, the auto industry is going to grow 20% in the next 5 years. We work on an industry that it takes 4 years for us to develop a car. From the day one we have an idea of a vehicle until we can put that production, it takes 4 years. So we need to look at the markets, each of the countries in the long term. We truly believe that we can succeed, we can fight the competitiveness, we can find the way to succeed in each of the markets, but we truly depend on a global footprint. We don't make investments in Argentina, or we don't make investments just in Brazil, thinking that it's just for the local market. We're actually looking on ways that we can actually export for all these different countries that we have some trade agreements. So the link between the private sector and the public sector is very important, because we cannot just continue investing in one country if we don't have the support to actually have a competitiveness to actually get advantage of a global perspective.
So what's specifically, what are the most important things government can do, and specifically what things can GM do that will help the society as a whole, as well as your bottom line and your own employees?
We have a challenge with the cost structure of our companies. The cost of the manpower is being critical in our region. We have some issues with inflation that drives to the cost. We have issues with taxes. We have challenges in every country about taxes in our market. That put a lot of pressures in the competitiveness that we have within the region. If we look at Mexico, Mexico is the most competitive market for us in terms of footprint for exporting vehicles. So there is a lot that we still think that we can do from a government policies, that we can improve our competitiveness in the region. But there is a lot of the social responsibility that we also need to take into consideration. There are several things that we do, and again, in the sense that as a team, it's not just the individual GM employee, but at the company, and along with all these different foundations that we work together. We have different programs in each of the GM organizations in the region, in which we either have educational programs for young generations, vulnerable generations. Like in Colombia, we train more than 200 people this year, trying to take them prepared to get into the auto industry. We have safety training on education, how people should use their vehicles, fuel consumption, safety in the road, with the vehicles, like explaining airbags, explaining how we should use seat belts. So there are a lot of activities that we do, training, educating. There are also activities that we do in terms of environment that we think that should be part of our role into these challenges.
Ricardo, talk a little about what you think the responsibility of the financial sector is on these social issues, and especially what you're trying to do with girls and women.
Well, Mr. Clinton, most of the things I humbly know you already stated in your question, and difficult things that sharing at the question you posed me, but I will try to address because the financial sector, we can talk a little bit. And as we all know, the financial sector has the primary role to enable savings and investing, and also provide protection against unwanted risks and volatility. Why not create new jobs and new enterprises? Actually, Itaú is a top 3 employer in this country. And this sector is crucial, especially after a crisis that we're going on in a global level and a local level, to provide those functions to society in a stable and sustainable way. And it's very important to analyze as society and as markets, as an environment, continue to evolve. It's important the financial sector moves in to fulfill the needs completely and effectively. And in this context that I'm putting on, it's exactly where the financial sector and all of us, we need to work together with all the stakeholders. And I mean, the industry partners, clients, investors, regulators, and society at large. It's only doing that we're going to move to fulfill the needs of the society. And because the financial sector is connected with all the sectors in the economy, we work as a lubricant or providing oxygen and oil to the system and to its gears in order to unleash the potential to influence positive change in markets and in society as a whole. And if I may say an example of that, of dialogue that we have reached significant relevance and potential to drive, scale, and to raise to another level new projects and new practices that we are doing. For example, take the voluntary agreements that we've signed with Equator Principles, for example. The Equator Principles of responsible investments, principles of sustainable insurance. They're all together are gathering together to increase the number of institutions that are committed to integrate social and environmental standards, especially into project finance. And Itaú part, for example, we're doing our part and our contribution in that regards. In Itaú, in 2004, we were the first bank in all emerging markets to sign the Equator Principles. And 2012, we conducted research based on the Equator Principles, and we financed very important project finance, 11 in total in that sense. And this year, 2013, we had the honor to be selected as the most sustainable company in Brazil and Latin America, not to mention that we're part of the Dow Jones World Sustainability Index for the last 15 years.
Be specific. Why did you get the award? What got you the award?
It's a composition of factors. It's very aligned to our vision to have a sustainable performance. That means that we are not only here, we are here to capacitate our employees. They will be, the best in the industry in order to provide excellent services to our clients that in the end of the day will be happy, will be loyal to the bank, will do more business. The bank will have better results so we can pay higher taxes to this government, pay back to society, fuel the institutes that we have, the Itaú Social Institute, Itaú Culture Institute, give back so that the bicycles that we have around here, Rio, São Paulo, other capitals in Latin America, is part of our urban mobility. They're also giving back to society. At the end of the day, also enriching shareholders that will put money back in the system. But we also have products that are green, that project finance that analyze environmental criteria. Actually, our corporate social and environmental risk rating is on the top of the credit risk rating. So it doesn't matter if the company is a AAA, if you're doing the wrong thing for the environment. We have two choices. Either we don't finance the project, or we help educate to mitigate those risks.
Let me ask you this. I'm betraying my ignorance now, but this is a very important question. Brazil had certain unmet infrastructure needs. Are they is it accepted that they should be met primarily by the government through the expenditure of tax money, or do you do the public-private partnerships? Or, for example, how much private sector involvement is there in, for example, developing roads or other basic infrastructure?
Infrastructure, no doubt, is a key pillar to guarantee the future progress of this country. We achieved a lot in the last 20 years, as you mentioned, reducing inflation, having growth, increasing wages, and having better income distribution and bringing
And do you finance it?
We finance, yes, we do partnership, private-public partnership and infrastructure, and we all know that increasing investment in infrastructure is the low-hanging fruit here for Brazil. And Brazil is interesting. President Clinton occupies the position 114th out of 148 in the World Economic Forum Infrastructure Index. And we have a lot to be done in order to raise the bar and increase our participation. And the good news is the government is launching a new set of reforms and concession programs for the next 5 years that amounts around $100 billion. And part of that's not only funded by the BNDES, but also by the private sector. And those partnerships, we can all do our job and participate in setting up the infrastructure and the pillars for future growth.
Mr. President, if I may, I think the infrastructure is a big challenge for us in the auto industry. Like we get to a point that we see why do we have more cars if we cannot move them? And we have been very, very successful, say, in the last couple of years to actually look at different ways promoting infrastructure on key areas that were key for us. So, for instance, I would say that less than a month ago, we opened for the first time the port of Rosario in Argentina. We were very short on different options in terms of ports in Argentina. And we said, you know, let's go talk to the government. We talked to the national government, we talked to the state government, and they just facilitated our contacts to get into the private companies that were interested also in developing the ports. But it was the pressure from GM, the needs that we had, that put the teams together, the public and the private sector, and we finally opened a very important channel, not just for GM, but it's a channel that is going to be important for all these different OEMs.
How much variation is there across the region in the level of private financing with public infrastructure? Are the countries all dramatically different?
They are all dramatically different. And I have to say that, you know, investment is the new paradigm in this region. And frankly, I think that we started very low on investment. Now the investment rate is approximately 22%, mostly from the public sector. I think the private sector has not yet come enough, and that is because there's a lack of trust sometimes with the rules, with the rule of law, and it is not sufficient, I would say, the public-private partnership. Itaú and BNDES, I think that you have done a very good match from my perspective. But the other thing, you know, when you see the people in the streets, what are they looking for? I mean, this is a region that has more income, no, in their houses. So indoors, they can buy refrigerators and tables and chairs, everything they need through private consumption. But when they go out of the door, they don't find the public goods. So from my perspective, to your question you were asking about public-private partnership, is basically to generate those public goods that will transform, for example, car industry, will transform energy sectors, will connectivity, these type of things.
I agree, but let's go back to the reason I was asking them those questions is that it seems to me that the region would benefit from having some real effort of cooperation among all the governments to agree on what the best laws are to facilitate private sector investment, because there's the investment needs. This is a big problem in the U.S. Believe it or not, even though we have, relatively speaking, low tax rates and a big private sector and relatively modest-sized government, we in the U.S. have been among the slowest countries in the world to embrace private investment in public infrastructure. And if you have a deficit of infrastructure in Brazil or throughout Latin America, it seems to me that one of the things that we could maybe facilitate is the establishment of at least ideal uniform standards for encouraging this. I mean, one of the most creative banks in the world is in Australia, and getting private capital for public infrastructure. I think it's a big deal. It adds to productivity, it adds to growth. Done right, it can promote sustainable development and environmental responsibility. And it's something I think we should all look at. You know, it's being done all over the world. I met with a man the other day who owns the biggest private port in China, which you think of as, but it's haphazard. There's not many places where you can go and say, here's a uniform set of incentives that ought to be available in every country that would accelerate public goods. I want to ask my friend Hernando de Soto something. I first learned of Hernando when he was the finance minister of Peru a long time ago. And he discovered that an enormous percentage of the businesses in Lima were in the informal sector, which is another way of saying they weren't legal. And he discovered that they were there not because they didn't want to pay taxes, but because it was so much hassle to legalize the business. There was so much. He also discovered that very few people had title to their homes, so they couldn't use them as a basis for credit to borrow money. And an enormous amount of, for example, America's economic growth has been financed for well over a century just by the availability of a simple home mortgage, but you have to have title first. So I thought about you, Hernando, when the kids took to the street in Cairo, because when we were working together years and years ago, the Egyptian government was thinking of a land reform, and they commissioned him to do a study of old Cairo, and he found that only 15% of the businesses were formally organized, and he told me, I said, this is terrible. He said, I'll never forget this. Hernando said to me, if you and I wanted to go to Egypt tomorrow and open a bakery, and we complied with all the government rules, it would take us 700 days. So here's my question. How much is this land issue, the title issue, the mortgage issue, is still a drag on growth and opportunity in Latin America, and what could we do about it?
Well, Mr. President, first of all, maybe you're not aware, but you've already done something about it. I think it wasn't that splashy. You mentioned Mexico and Brazil, two loved countries, but the country of the highest growth in Latin America is Peru, from 1993 until 2011. Now we're all taking a nosedive, and the country that is the less nosediving is Peru. And what did Peru do? By your government, it funded the biggest empowerment of the poor program. We actually went, you have a zone of Lima that's called El Cono Norte. 75% of the homes are in there. 50% of are new enterprises. And that was all done with USAID money. Not only that, by using that money to also empower people in the coca fields not to rely on the terrorists for protection of their land. We've defeated terrorism way before any of our neighbors have. And the thing is, it didn't take a lot of money. It just took a lot of property in the right hands. China actually even grows more than us. And the reason China moves ahead to a great extent is because there's very committed leaders who are out there empowering people. And that's just what happens. You see, property isn't just real estate. It's about empowering people. I recently saw one of your conversations with Steve Jobs, and I'm heading towards Cairo. Steve Jobs, who was a very good friend of yours, and you had a lot of very close conversations with him, was an Arab, which is what a lot of people don't know, right? Syria, right? Now, he's doing a lot, he did a lot better before he died than Syria's doing now. But the difference was that his father was able to finance his education because he landed 3 mortgages to fund it. And not only that, when you were talking with him 4 days before he launched his iPod, the reason he was able to collect any money on his iPod is he owned all the property rights to the iPod idea. That's what the difference is. But it comes natural maybe to North Americans and to others that you have property. You understand, in Latin America, property is a very rare privilege in terms of being solid and being able to protect yourself from expropriation. Now let's get close to Egypt. The guys in the streets, because that's where Americans would tend to focus, anybody would tend to focus, any of us who had a university education, is all these kids who can't get jobs. But the question is, who creates the jobs? The jobs are created by entrepreneurs. It's Steve Jobs who creates the jobs. It's Bill Gates, your friends, who create the jobs. It's all these guys who were no one before and who now are able to earn something. So here's the question. How did the Arab Spring start? It didn't start in Tahrir Square. It ended in Tahrir Square, and there it is. But it started because a whole bunch of 64 young entrepreneurs without education, like Bouazizi in Tunisia, lit up. And when they lit up, the first thing they said is there wasn't a call to religion. And it wasn't a call to ideology. What he said before he died, Bouazizi, was, why can't the poor buy and sell? In other words, turning back to your question of why Latin American infrastructure, what did you do, Mr. President, before there was foreign aid in the United States to grow? You gave your universities and the guys who were going to do transportation across the United States and railways, you gave them land grants. Because land grants is investment because property is capital. So I find, Mr. President, that all we have to do is do what you started doing 150 years ago, and it'll be much better.
Okay, let me ask yeah. We only have 12 or 15 minutes, but I've got 1,000 questions I want to ask, but this has just been the setup. So let me give you an example. I have been asked, one of the reasons I feel good about Brazil's future is in the last 7 or 5 years, I've been asked to speak at 2 different meetings. One was a meeting of all the ethanol producers. And they asked me to come and speak, and I said, why do you want me to speak? The Brazilian cane ethanol gets you the equivalent of 9.5 gallons of gasoline, or 9.5 gallons of ethanol for every 1 gallon of gasoline required to produce it. And in the US, we're still making it with corn. It's about 2.8 or 9 gallons for every one. It's the best in the world. And for 5 years, you've used more ethanol than, maybe 6 years now, than gasoline. And they said, oh, but we have a big problem here. He said, we are contributing to rainforest destruction. And I said, why? You have to have too much topsoil to grow sugarcane. You can't possibly use the rainforest, which has no topsoil. He said, no, but we're taking so much of the deep soil, we're pushing the cattle ranchers and the soybean farmers who are in the same area into the rainforest. Tell us how to stop that. And then I went to Manaus a couple of years ago to a sustainability conference. When everybody started screaming in America, you may have noticed we have some political conflicts in the United States. And people only go to meetings with people they already agree with. We have no discrimination in America anymore, really. We're not discriminating against racial minorities, religious minorities. There's less discrimination against women, less discrimination against gays. We just don't want to be around anybody we disagree with. It's a serious problem in the US. So I go to Manaus, and they're the heads of the utilities, the heads of the oil companies, the big business organizations, the representatives of environmental groups, the lady who was your Green Party candidate for president, representatives of the Amazon tribes. They're all sitting there, and they're actually sitting at tables with each other, talking to each other as if they are decent human beings. This passes for progress in the United States today. I say that seriously. So I want to ask this is the setup. What is the role of the private sector? I'm going to come back to your question in a minute. In trying to deal with the sustainability issues, and in particularly trying to accelerate growth and reduce inequality by being more inclusive of girls and women. That's still a problem here. There's still underrepresentation of girls in the schools all the way up through higher education. and women in the workforce, even though you two are a rebuke to that. The truth is, if you look at the numbers, there's a lot of human potential in country after country after country in Latin America that's not been tapped. So what can the private sector do to change private and public policies? And should there be more civil society advocacy on the girls and women front?
Can I start?
Yeah.
I think that in Latin America we have women's need to have 3 autonomies: economic autonomy, physical autonomy, and political autonomy. Economic autonomy, we need to earn the same salaries at the same let's say level of labor or education. We don't have that. It's only 36% less what women earn at doing the same job.
How many countries mandate equal pay by law?
Well, none. In Latin America, none. And that's the problem, number one. Number two, women don't have access to assets, for example, to financial assets, to land in many cases. So that's another of the economic autonomy we need. What can the private sector do? Private sector can be very helpful in terms of opening up the gates for women to go up. Women in this region are more educated than men. Believe me, they are. But they don't have the opportunity to get there. And they are much better in technology than men, frankly speaking. So if they are giving the opportunity in GM, and you know this, because of course you live with 2 women that are very powerful on many fronts, so on many fronts, so you know that.
It's certainly better educated
yes,
than the man in my family.
So yes, and I wouldn't say political autonomy because I know that you know what it is about, but the other thing is the physical autonomy. You know, one of the main problems of the region is teen pregnancy. Those young women that are poor, that get pregnant with no services at all at their disposal. And I think the private sector, to come back to your question, can do 3 things. Number one is to really give the opportunity to young women to come in their companies to the top, not to be the secretaries or the cleaners, to really give them the opportunity. And secondly, they could open up care centers because women in this region are taking care of children, old people, and people with different capacities with not being paid at all. So that is something that I really believe we have to protect.
Let me just say, I want to call on you, but it's good, huh? This problem of women getting into education before they get into economics is a global one too. Just for your information, there are now more, and have been for 4 or 5 years now, there are more women than men in universities in Saudi Arabia. But the workforce participation gap is still quite high. The Saudis are now beginning to deport or remove approvals from immigrant workers in an attempt to diversify the workforce within their country. It's going to be very interesting. They can't do it unless they bring women in. But this is a global problem too, so go ahead.
We can stay hours talking about that topic, and I will split that in 2 pieces. I think that we have a cultural issue first. Especially, I moved to Argentina a year and a half ago. My family's from Argentina, as you mentioned, and I was born in Brazil and raised in Brazil and Argentina and US. And what I noticed in Argentina is that there are a lot of women getting into the universities, a lot of women finishing the university, but what happens is that after they finish, they don't want to continue working. So there is this cultural issue that comes at the very early ages, like when they are 10, 12 years old, where they don't see that having a job is part of their culture. They still have parents who think that it's fine for you to get married and have kids. So there is a cultural issue on how much you can look for in terms of your personal development or your personal satisfaction. Then you have what we're doing on the private sector. I think that the private sector can do sometimes much more than the public sector. And why is that? Because we have the jobs. We have the ability to hire. We have the ability to develop the self-esteem among women. We have the ability to make sure that there is no inequality. So at GM, we have been working, I would say that for the last 15 years on diversity. And we have several funny stories on how much we have learned throughout these 15 years. I remember I was working at the Arlington truck plant in the US, and we finally launched this big global program towards diversity. And we're really excited. We say, okay, we are going to start talking about African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, and gays, lesbians. And we were all out of the plant on the floor and say, okay, let's make sure that we classified everybody and everybody feel comfortable that we respect them. And we start receiving notes. We receive a letter from a person who was gay and say, why are you doing that? You're not showing respect. So we learn a lot on how to make sure that we respect people under what they believe is being respectful. So at GM, we have same salaries for everybody. Like, we have different levels, and the levels, regardless of your gender, is the salary level that you're going to have. And we're seeing more and more women interested in our business. And GM, we have several top executives worldwide that shows that we can do that. We are respected. At the beginning, we had quotas, and everybody asked whether or not having quotas is a good thing. I think it's a good thing at the beginning until it gets part of the culture or the DNA of the company. So we had quotas for several years, and now it's like a natural thing to look how many women we have in our teams, how many women are accessing to leadership positions.
Well, first of all, thank you. I think that one of the things that's always been curious to me, just observing, is that Latin America has done way better than the United States has politically in electing women presidents of countries and governors of states and mayors of cities, and having all this political exposure for women at the highest level. But there's still a big disparity in workforce participation, and and especially among the poor, trying to move up into the middle class and get their families started. So this is helpful, what you said. Go ahead. I know you've been very active in this. So
if I may complement what they said, I think first of all, the private sector should learn more with what you're doing in that foundation, President Clinton, and study the work, study the success cases, and applying in the private sector. Start with the Clinton family, which is composed 2/3 by women and 1/3 by men. So it's majority out there. Women at the...
My odds are even worse than that. You have no idea.
Not only numbers, right?
Women, we all know, that has been at the core of the initiatives of what your foundation is doing, especially because the work of your wife, Hillary, that has been giving a lot of attention to this topic, and as his role as public servant. I'm sure you look at the political arena here in Latin America, you have presidents already making history. You have in Brazil, in Argentina, you have in Chile pretty soon, now in Germany, in the developed world, and pretty soon the US will catch up soon in that regard. But when we should be taking notes about what you're doing, and you ask, why women? Basically, in my view, that's the simple ingredient for growth, and we cannot ignore this ingredient. And as Larry Summers says, and you know him very well, he said this is potentially the highest investment available out there, and we can't ignore women for investment because they represent perhaps the best hope for fighting poverty in the region. And the good news, that is true globally as well, as you mentioned in your question. And women, when we look and analyze, there seems to be better and more responsible managing budgets and investments than men. For example, when we did our study at Itaú, we found out that 85% of the household income is managed by women, especially in the low-income segments. And when women, they hold assets and they gain income, the family money is definitely well managed and more cleverly spent on nutrition, on medicine, and also housing rather than beer. And therefore, children at the end of the day will be healthier and will be more productive to society. But when you ask how Itaú has helped the cause, this is not new for us because since the early days, we've been using microfinance to intervene and help increase the probability women can open a business. And once they open a business, they can have better income. And also, since a long time, men and women have equal opportunities at Itaú in terms of also serving products and services. To give an example, 50% of our clients are women. In terms of our company clients, half of our small and medium enterprises clients are at least have one woman as an owner, and 1/4 have women as a major partner. And this project that we did, and will be explained more in the afternoon, is a partnership with the IDB and the IFC and Itaú, the Public-Private Partnership, to foster women entrepreneurs. And this project basically, we understand women's and men's needs, and women are more happier with our products and services, but they have specific behaviors and needs. And we have 3 phases that we went to explore this project. Number 1 was with the support of IFC and the IDB. We did a broad analysis of the female population to analyze how they behave and what's their role as women, as leaders, and as entrepreneurs. And the second phase, we built this new credit model that was approved by the IFC, and at the end of the day, the output was the loan facility of $470 million in order to be applied in the sector. And the third last phase of the project, we learned that women would love to participate in this new position that in the new project that we are creating. And we believe that the greatest importance of having this gender subject well through in order to comply with the needs of society. And we did some kind of work groups of co-creation where we involve women, customers and non-customers, to find out the better solution for that. And then doing that, we believe we can change the world for a better place.
You know, let me say something quickly. You spoke about Bolsa Familia, right? Okay. Bolsa Familia was a success thanks to women, because the cash transfer program goes to women. And secondly, the mobile phones make people have access to financial assets, like in Peru. Peru has more mobile phones than any place in the world, I think, because they have 2 per family or something like that. But the question is, how do you get access to financing through the phones, through the Bolsa Familia, through the oportunidades? So the government has a role, and then comes in the private sector, and the women, of course, women first.
I wish we had time to talk about mobile phones and technology generally, but I want to come back to a question I asked Hernando before we came out here, with regard to sustainability. First, I think Latin America generally and some specific countries are way ahead of much of the rest of the world in a genuine practical commitment to proving that we can grow the economy and stabilize or reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. I was in Costa Rica a couple of years ago, and Laura Chinchilla, the president of Costa Rica, wanted to come here, and then they had a local political issue, and she had to stay. But 92% of their electricity is clean energy. And they have made a decision to go to 100%. They still have massive geothermal potential. And when I was down there, this woman, this is inconceivable in America. She represents the center-right party. She said, so we're in good shape on electricity, but we still import $1 billion worth of oil. And I said, well, what do you want me to do about it? She said, get me an electric car company down here, and we will buy every car they can produce until every Costa Rican is in one. We're a little country. We have a school and a health clinic in every community. I'll put the recharging stations up, and we'll be that'll be our whole economic brand. Now, that's probably the most extreme version, but here's the point I want to make. If you go to China today and you see the drying up of the Yellow River and the Chinese trying to solve it by collecting the Yangtze and the Yellow, connecting them through canals, a strategy which may dry them both up. And you still see, no matter what people say, there is still a conflict between what all the scientists say we have to do in reducing our greenhouse gas emissions and what we know we want to do to provide growth and economic opportunity. So let's take a Brazilian example, which is a good news, bad news story. Under President Lula and the beginning of President Rousseff's term, there was a 75% reduction in the annual rate of deforestation in the rainforest. The major gain made was to make a deal with the big timber companies and get them out. Then there is pressure coming from thousands and thousands and thousands of points from basically people growing soybeans and grazing cattle who can use, but only for a little while, the very thin topsoil you get if you clear the rainforest. So I told Hernando on the way out here that I had read that Brazil still has 145 million hectares of arable farmland with no forest that is not under cultivation. And the question is, could the country design, because last year we had an uptick in destruction of the rainforest, could the country design a program like the Homestead program in America? Is there something we could do that would give the people who do soybeans and cattle an opportunity to have land that gets them out of the rainforest business too? I don't think anybody wakes up in the morning just wanting to tear down what you all know is a global treasure and what still produces 20% of the world's oxygen we get from non-ocean sources. This is a very big deal. So say what you think about this. This is a very big issue, just generally. I hope it will be a discussion for the next 2 days. You're doing great, but none of us are doing enough.
Couldn't agree more with you, Mr. President. I think the important thing to understand when we're looking at all of these problems is that before, as Alicia was saying, the rule of law comes in, there's the rule of the informal economy. In other words, nobody just lands in Latin America someplace where it's simply peaceful. It's already inhabited. So if you don't bring the rule of law in, it's the criminals and it's the informals who will take over. It's that simple, like in the United States in the old days in the 19th century. So here's what happens. When you go into, for example, the Amazon, before you had to take out the loggers, I think you said, out of the Amazon, you got to take these guys out. Well, they were there, in many cases, uninvited, but they invited themselves. So either we come in and put in property law and decide by law who's going to get it with rational criteria, or they're going to take over. It's that simple. It's not going to be the moon. So the issue is this.
But you also have to give them an alternative. That's what I'm saying. If you've got all this land out here, even if it's privately owned, they might be willing to sell it or work it out or lease it out so it can be farmed.
That means what you need is a property law that works. And a property law that works, but not a property law that works just to suit the private sector as it is today. A property law that helps the poor, because they're the guys on the ground. They're the guys on the ground. You see, the big thing that I think you did in the United States, the big thing that, unfortunately, your deceased friend now, Mandela, did, is emancipate people by trusting the poor. In other words, they started looking at the poor not as a problem, how do we help them, how do we assist them, but rather they're the solution. And that's what property law does for the poor. It makes them provide solutions. And what we've got in Latin America is all the laws in the world. We've copied your laws, we've photocopied them, we've scanned them, we've printed them, but they're not adequate to our population. And those parts of the Amazon, as a matter of fact, for example, in our case, that are developed in Peru, where there is very, very bad property law, what makes them stick? What makes all those natural resources that you're talking about, that being so successful, but sometimes ecologically unfriendly? One, a company, foreign or local, gets a property title from Peru. It's more or less all right, but not great. Then it gets inscribed in a bilateral investment treaty with the United States, where the Peruvian Congress can no longer intervene. Now, from a private point of view, that's looking much more solid. Then it goes to the United States, the overseas private investment company, then puts a seal of guarantee. Now, that's a hell of a good-looking title. Then it goes to the World Bank, MIGA, for the guarantee, and now it's the best title you ever saw. they can now take it up to the financial markets and say, look, folks, I've got a title that even President Obama can't take away from eminent domain. Have you ever seen anything so beautiful in your life? Somewhere at the Fed, somebody says that signal coming out, I need $5 billion bucks, and the Fed puts out $5 billion bucks. Based on what? On a Peruvian piece of land with an American security title. The thing is, we got to start doing what you're doing, but we got to do it for the poor. And once you start doing it for the poor, who are the guys who are going to start settling, because you see, once you start settling or doing anything in Latin America, anybody who's in private investment will tell you that the poor are going to squat, that the poor are going to take it away from them. Once you bring them in the game, once you make them responsible, then they will not squat, they will not take things away from you, and the law starts working for everybody.
Let's thank our panelists. Didn't they do a good job? They were quite interesting, I thought. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.